What went wrong with Israel? A new book by Israeli-American professor Omer Bartov explains how Zionism led to genocide and why the political ideology itself cannot be reformed. On this special edition of our program, I'll speak to the author of Israel, What Went Wrong. I'm Andrea Sankey. Today's newsmaker is Omer Bartov. Well, voices like Professor Bartov's may be a minority in Israel, but they are gaining some traction as the tiny nation of just 10 million people pulls itself deeper into armed conflicts on its borders as well as further abroad. Many Israelis and others are asking if their national strategy is the right one. Omer Bartov says it's clearly not. He believes the genocide perpetrated by Israel in Gaza and the decline of the nation itself is rooted in Zionism, a political ideology that can't be reformed, but the state of Israel can. Here's a look.
It was portrayed as a liberation struggle after centuries of oppression, displacement, and discrimination. Zionism was born in the 19th century as an idea of Jewish emancipation, but over time, it's become associated with militarism and the exclusion of Palestinians. In his new book, Israeli-American historian Omer Bartov asks what went wrong and how Zionism has evolved into an extremist ideology. In the late 1890s, Hungarian Jewish Theodor Herzl gave Zionism its political form. He proposed that the solution to anti-Semitism required a Jewish state in what Jews consider their historical homeland, Palestine. Herzl encouraged Jewish people to buy land in Palestine while working to rally world powers' support for the idea. Years later, the Balfour Declaration gave the British colonial government's support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people, but it also called for respect to the rights of non-Jewish communities. At the time, the Jews made up around 10% of Palestine's population, yet the subsequent years have seen mass Jewish immigration to the land.
The main case of the Arabs is against the British government's policy in Palestine, a policy which, if continued, will surely have as a result the replacement of the Arabs by the Jews.
In 1936, angered by the Jewish influx, Arab Palestinians rose against British rule and its support for Zionism. The revolt was brutally suppressed, but it also, in 1939, led the British to limit Jewish immigration. Yet with the increasing persecution of Jews in Europe, World War II, and the Holocaust, Jewish immigration increased dramatically. By 1945, more than 500,000 Jews were living in Palestine. Zionists launched a terror campaign against the British, and in 1948, after the British colonial mandate expired, Zionists declared a Jewish state, and Israel was born.
A world Jewry that will not put up with shame and battle dress, determined to defend the faith that after so much of struggle and effort and sacrifice and longing and prayer through the centuries has finally, by the grace of God, been reconstituted.
Surrounding Arab states then declared war on the newly formed State of Israel, which they lost, and what followed has been the displacement, killing, and destruction of Palestinian lives. 750,000 Palestinians, around 80% of the whole population, have been expelled from their land. Many were pushed into the occupied West Bank and Gaza, and many others became refugees in neighboring countries. And they have never been allowed to return to their homes. Without a written constitution and official border, Zionism has become a state ideology that is characterized by expansionism and colonialism. In 1967, Israel went to war with its Arab neighbors and occupied all the remaining Palestinian territories, as well as the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, and East Jerusalem. Despite later being reversed, a 1975 United Nations resolution called Zionism a form of racism and racial discrimination. But in 2018, the Knesset passed a basic law that defines Israel as a nation-state of the Jewish people. Prime Minister Netanyahu called it a defining moment in the annals of Zionism. Yet many saw it as another manifestation of the Israeli state's ethno-nationalistic nature.
We are victims of Zionism, and we will never recognize something that deepens the superstructure of the Jewish people compared to the inferiority of the Arab according to the law. Jewish state and democratic state cannot be together.
Israel's most notorious actions, though, began after the October 7th Hamas attack. The surprise incursion from Gaza killed more than 1,200 Israelis, and over 200 people were captured by the Palestinian group. In response, Israel launched a brutal military campaign in Gaza. More than 72,000 people have been killed. The relentless assault has forced Gaza's population to flee again and again. 90% of Gaza's infrastructure has been destroyed. The blockade and unlivable conditions pushed many Palestinians into famine. Omer Bartov believes Zionism as a state ideology has led to this genocide, and the attacks have not stopped. In the past year, Israel has struck Iran, Lebanon, Syria, Qatar, and Yemen. Much of Gaza is still under occupation, and the expansion of the illegal settlements in the occupied West Bank is killing the possibility of a Palestinian state. Despite being a minority, some Israelis are taking to the streets to call for peace and equality. But will their voices be able to convince others to transform Zionism and the State of Israel?
Well, another question to be asked is whether Israel can transform if ruled by Zionism. Omer Bartov describes the doctrine as one that sought to emancipate European Jewry from oppression and persecution, which transformed into a state ideology of ethno-nationalism focused on the violent domination of the Palestinians. And Professor Bartov joins me now from Cambridge, Massachusetts, to help us better understand the position he takes in his new book, Israel, What Went Wrong. Professor, thanks so much for being with me. Why this book? Why now?
But first of all, thank you very much for having me. This book is the result of everything that I've been writing and thinking since October 7th, but in many ways, my thinking as it has evolved about Israel and Zionism long before that. So in many ways, the events following October 7th accentuated greatly what I'd been dreading about Israel many years before that. So it's an attempt, as you said, it's an attempt to understand what happened to Zionism and how it evolved from a movement of liberation and emancipation for Jews in Eastern Europe, where they were a minority that was exposed to increasing persecution, violence, and eventually genocide, to a state ideology, which it became in 1948, that became increasingly militaristic, expansionist, violent, and eventually racist, and as we saw in Gaza, also genocidal. That's really what I'm trying to understand.
Right. Do you think it was a gradual progression, or was there a point when you could pinpoint, in a sense, where it genuinely tipped?
Well, it was both, really. It was gradual in the sense that in the 1920s and 30s, in the interwar period, there were two things happening at the same time. Zionism, or the Jewish community in Palestine, which was growing during that period, was actually providing a shelter for Jews who were trying to flee Europe as Europe became increasingly violent vis-a-vis Jews. And in that sense, it was serving the purpose that it promised to serve, that is to rescue Jews from persecution and violence. But at the same time, it's during those years that the Jews in Palestine are encroaching increasingly on Palestinian land and creating conflict between Jews and the indigenous Palestinian population. But the tipping point is really 1948, when following the war of 1948 and the expulsion of the vast majority of Palestinians, as I trace in the book, Israel is faced with a choice because it promises, this new state promises to issue a constitution that would be in the spirit of its declaration of a state that promised equal treatment to all people in the country. But that constitution is never actually adopted by Israel. Israel to this day has no constitution. It also has no borders that it recognizes. And because of that, Israel never really becomes a normal state and a normal civil society, but takes on Zionism as its state ideology. And as such, it begins to tilt more and more in the direction that I described. It's not inevitable. There are various changes on the way, of course.
Professor, perhaps I should have prefaced this chat we're having with just a bit of your background to illustrate where you're actually coming from. You were born and raised in Israel. Your father was a Zionist, but you've been speaking out now, of course, against the genocide in Gaza, and you insist that calling it genocide does not make you anti-Semitic. And I think that's key here. You have to explain why so many of your countrymen equate your position against Zionism with anti-Semitism.
Yes, I mean, people do, but of course that's a sort of propaganda point of view, what's called hasbara, that's Israeli propaganda. Look, I mean, anti-Semitism is a prejudice, and it attributes particular qualities to Jews. Zionism is an ideology. You may like it, you may not like it, you may adopt it, you may reject it, but it's an ideology. There are many Jews around the world, and there were many before, who were not Zionists or anti-Zionists. Many of the ultra-Orthodox Jews around the world are anti-Zionists. They don't believe that there should be a Jewish state before the Messiah arrives. It does not make them anti-Semites. So this position, which was really adopted and propagated by the Israeli government, most successfully by the multiple Netanyahu administrations, is one whose goal is to prohibit any criticism of Israel's increasingly indefensible policies by saying that such criticism is anti-Semitic. As you know, I was born and raised in Israel. I served for 4 years in the Israeli army and subsequently also in the reserve. I've written a great deal about the Holocaust. So to describe me as anti-Semitic is somewhat bizarre. But that is what this kind of propaganda tries to do.
Fair enough. But then you say that you don't believe Zionism can be reformed, but the State of Israel can. So explain how the State of Israel can change to become a non-apartheid entity. What would actually need to happen? You've described in your book some kind of shock therapy. What does that mean?
So first of all, look, I mean, states change. Israel is there to stay. It's not going away as a state, as an entity. But states that have particular ideologies, if they want to survive and thrive, have to change that. South Africa was an apartheid state until 1994. Nazi Germany was the most violent genocidal state in modern history. But Germany exists today. So first of all, it is possible, and it has happened in the past. How that would change? It would change by Israel finally giving up on Zionism, which it should have done really in 1948, as I said, and convert itself into a normal state with a constitution. It can do that, but in order to do that, it would have to regulate, to finally resolve the main issue at the core of that state, which is the relationship between Jews and Palestinians. There's 7 million Jews and 7 million Palestinians living between the river and the sea. And the 7 million Palestinians are under the boot of the 7 million Jews. And none of them is going away. So they have to find a way to share that space. When they do, the nature of the state will change. It can be a land for all. It can be binational state, it can be a confederation, but what it cannot remain is what it is now, which is a state with an apartheid regime in the West Bank, with the genocidal regime in Gaza, and apartheid creeping rapidly into Israel itself. That is not sustainable morally, ethically, and in the long run, politically.
It's interesting. I mean, your arguments make sense, but it's difficult to get so many of your, again, fellow countrymen to really agree with you. So while you say Zionism is not reformable, the state of Israel actually is, you have to explain to those who say, you know, Zionism only means maintaining Israel as a Jewish state. So changing that state would mean stripping Israel of its Jewish state status. And I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a majority of Israelis that would ever agree with that. So how do you go about making these changes, bringing about this kind of shock therapy to make Israel the kind of peaceful and democratic state that you'd like to see?
So look, I mean, two things are needed. As I said, shock therapy, what I mean by that is that there needs to be much greater pressure on the state of Israel to realize the limits of its own power, which right now are being set in Washington, D.C., not in Jerusalem. When those limits on Israeli power are returned to Jerusalem, Israel will have to opt for politics rather than bombs, because it will not have enough bombs and enough strength and enough political international capital that the United States provides it with. So that's what I mean by shock therapy. And that is not happening right now, but may, and there's signs that it may happen both from the United States and from Europe. The second thing is to find a way, as you say, for Israelis to accept the notion to change their thinking about the nature of the state itself. Now, it is possible, and there is a plan that I support, a confederation plan, which would create a Jewish state, which exists already, but along the borders of 67, and a Palestinian state that would exist on the other side of the 1967 border. The problem, of course, is the issue of Palestinians. But according to this plan, there would be a distinction between citizenship and residence. So people could be citizens of one state and residents of another. You could be a Palestinian living in Houston, Texas, and you trace your family to Haifa, and you could become a citizen of the state of Palestine and apply for residence in Haifa. And you could be a Jewish settler if you decide to stay in the state of Palestine, and you would be a citizen of Israel and a resident of Palestine. But you would have to abide by the laws of that state, and if you do not, then you would be deported. So there would be two states. They would have open borders. They would have institutions that would represent the confederation, and both groups would have what they want. As you say, what both Jews and Palestinians want is a right of self-determination and a right of return. And this would enable that to happen without violence and without uprooting populations from one place to another.
Realistically, what are the chances that you think that could ever happen? I mean, you're again talking even about a two-state solution that so many have said is just out of the question now. It's gone too far beyond ever reconciling with two states. So what are the chances of that peace, in your vision, actually being instituted?
Well, first of all, it's not the defunct two-state solution, which indeed is not possible anymore. As I said, it's a confederation that makes it possible for people to move across the borders and live in the other state. What are the possibilities of that happen? Right now, there's very few people who support it. But I would say that even opinion polls today show that both Jews and Palestinians in that territory, if you were to offer them a viable plan and to show them that there is power behind it, that there's a political leadership willing to pursue it, they would support it, because all people there, or most people at least, want to have a better future for themselves and for their children. But to start that off, there has to be massive international pressure, first of all, on Israel, which has largely a hegemony of power there. And that will have to come, first of all, from the United States. There are, as I say, indications of a major swing in American politics vis-a-vis Israel. When Israel is put into its proper place politically, that change may begin to happen, and the new political leadership that we are waiting for among Jewish Israelis and among Palestinians will begin to emerge.
It's interesting. I mean, you say the main factor, I guess, would be international pressure, but I've heard others argue that a lot of this goes back to the education in Israel and how it has shaped the mindset of Israelis, as well as those in the diaspora. I've heard arguments that it has built a sort of, and I'll call it kind of a paranoid victim mentality, whereby many actually believe that everybody hates them somehow, and they fundamentally can't trust others, so they're on their own to fight for themselves, to defend the state of Israel, because they're alone in this battle. And yes, right now they have the support of the United States, but even if they lose that, they're determined to fight on their own. So how do you change that education, that mentality, to make sure that it's not just international pressure forcing change, but Israelis themselves would want to change?
So first of all, you're right. I mean, and I write about this in my book. There are two major elements that are making for a particular Israeli mentality. One is the understanding of the Holocaust not only as something that happened in the past, but as an imminent danger. This sense, as Israel became more and more strong and more dominant in the region, the sense of an existential danger increased because of the manipulation of the memory of the Holocaust by various Israeli governments and other educators. And the second element is the occupation itself, of course, which has lasted for most of the regime and has created a sense of superiority by Jews and a dehumanization of Palestinians. So that is true. How does it change? As I said, people change their minds when they realize what are the limits that they're presented with. Prime Minister Netanyahu can say, even if the United States does not help us, we will continue fighting with whatever we have. But when he's ordered by President Trump to turn his aircraft back, he does that because he knows precisely that without the United States, he can't accomplish that. And Israel, while it sort of suffers from a case of euphoria of power, is also a very fragile society. It is very well aware that without major support from its European allies and most importantly from the United States, it cannot survive and it cannot continue this kind of politics. Yeah. So I believe, yes, there would have to be a major change in Israeli education, Israeli mentality, as well as Palestinian education, mind you. But that will come only when these pressures come to bear. Without that, of course, Israel can continue, although it is heading into an abyss. This kind of politics that supposedly supports Israel is actually leading it down a slippery path to an authoritarian, messianic regime that will eventually implode, will not be able to exist in the long run.
Right. When you talk about that abyss, you bring us right back to the genocide and the question of whether the genocide and the general aggression will actually stop at Gaza, because we know there is a vision for a number of people in power now in Israel for that greater Israel that they believe they're entitled to at any cost. And meanwhile, you have an international so-called legal system that refuses to enforce the very laws that were created because of what happened to the Jews in Europe. So there's no backup. There's no way, really, it seems, to go forward with preventing that vision, movement toward enforcing that vision of their greater Israel.
You know, one of the ironies of the situation is that when Hamas launched its attack on October 7th, its goal was to regionalize the conflict because the Palestinian issue had been entirely swept under the rug. Now, Of course, Gaza has been destroyed. These Hamas leaders have all been killed. But what they intended actually happened. That is, the conflict has been regionalized. Israel is now fighting in Lebanon, in Syria, in the West Bank, against Yemen, against Iran, and still in Gaza. So, yes, there are people in Israel who would like to extend the country to any limit that they can reach. But there are also limits to the capability of Israel. And as I say, you're right, of course, the international community, that international legal edifice that was created after World War II to prevent the kind of crimes that were committed, among others, against Jews, has been shattered now, both by the Russian invasion of Ukraine and even more so by Israel, because the people who gave it impunity are those countries that claim to be the main defenders of this international system. But I think that we are seeing the limits of this. I think we're seeing a moment in which finally, at long last, very belatedly, these very same countries, both Europe and the United States, are beginning to realize where all this is heading and will set limits to Israel in the future. This will not help all the tens of thousands of Palestinian victims, but it may force a different arrangement and a much more peaceful period to the Middle East in general and for Israelis and Palestinians in particular.
Professor Bartov, one final question for you. If you can, speak to the divisions that you've addressed before within Israel, divisions that deeply disturb you, especially when it comes to the so-called Ashkenazi elite. How is that also hindering real progress toward peace in the state of Israel as well?
Well, that's a complex question because what is called the Ashkenazi elite is both in part a reality and in large part also a kind of political rhetoric. Much of the elite in Israel, within the military, the other security services, in politics today is actually not Ashkenazi. These are Mizrahi Jews who have carried a sense of resentment, and with good reason, against what had been the Labour Party Ashkenazi elite of the 1950s and 60s, which was eventually overturned in 1977 by the election of Menachem Begin. But these resentments still play a major role in Israel, and there's a sense that these so-called Ashkenazi elites that sip espressos on the beach in Tel Aviv are those who also support peace, support reconciliation with the Palestinians, and are generally naive and don't understand the realities of the Middle East. That's a kind of discourse that you see in Israel. To my mind, I have to say that what I've been much more shocked by since October 7th about Israeli society in general, whether it's Ashkenazi or Mizrahi, whether it's religious or secular, the young and the old, and the young even more than the old, is the total indifference to what the sort of horrors and devastation that they wreaked on Gaza. People are they're in total denial of that. And that denial, of course, is part of a long process. And without breaching that, without putting an end to that, without looking back and admitting the wrongs that, of course, were at the peak during the destruction of Gaza, but go back all the way to 1948, this society will not be able to heal, including its internal divisions between Ashkenazi and Mizrahi, religious and secular, and so forth. These are the fundamental building blocks of Israeli society that have to be understood, have to be confronted, and will lead, hopefully, when they are, to some kind of healing process within Jewish Israeli society and between Jews and Palestinians.
Okay. Professor Bartov, so unfortunately we are completely out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers, so I'd sincerely like to thank you for joining us and thank our viewers as well for tuning in. Remember, you can follow us on social media and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.